Hello, I'm Eduardo Gonçalves from the Climate Group, and welcome to Climate TV. Is climate change going to be affecting food production and food security? And is farming part of the solution? With me to discuss this is Roger Johnson, the President of the National Farmers Union in the United States. So, Roger Johnson, you've been to Climate Week before. Can you tell us why it's such an important event?
Well, it's important because it raises awareness of climate change and what's going on in the world, what's happening to the environment with respect to farmers in particular, family farmers. It's important that the general public understand that it is becoming more and more difficult to produce food and fiber and fuel in agriculture because of the increasing climate variability that is a direct result of climate change.
If climate change continues unabated, what sort of future are we looking at for America's farmers?
Well, I think you're looking at a future that's going to be variable. It's going to be uncertain. It's going to be punctuated with a lot of extreme weather events. You'll have production swings that will be abnormal. You will see more flooding. You'll see more droughts. You will see all of these. Agriculture is inherently a highly variable business environment anyway, just because of the presence of so many different variables, so many different risks. Weather itself has always been variable. You increase that even more, and you just increase the likelihood that you're going to have production shortfalls, and not uniformly across the food system, but rather in particular areas. You may, for example, see more production variables among the like the fruit and vegetable kind of producers, the annual crops that are much more susceptible to varying climate and weather conditions.
So, what will the changes in American farm production mean in terms of both America's ability to feed itself, but also agricultural exports?
Well, yeah, I think it's likely that America is going to be doing quite well in terms of feeding itself. The real question is how much production is going to be made available, as you indicated, for the export markets to feed other places around the world. We have a relatively small population here, given the amount of resources that we have. So I think America is probably going to be in a better spot than a lot of other places around the world. Nonetheless, when you have this increased variability, you have these additional stressors that take place. You have likely a need for higher capital because anytime you have a business environment that is more variable, that has more ups and more downs associated with it, you're in a position where, from a business standpoint, you need to have more equity, more capital into those businesses. That makes it more likely that smaller family farmers end up getting squeezed out of the picture, that you see larger operations that assume more of that risk. And it seems likely that with increased climate variability, you will see over time, you'll see higher food prices. You will see a higher percentage of disposable income. And I'm not just talking in America here, I'm talking around the world, higher percentages of disposable income that are going to be spent on the necessities of life, on food, on shelter, on those kinds of things, and less of that disposable income that's going to be available for the other things that are not absolutely essential in life.
And presumably, there are going to be local farming communities and regions that are going to be particularly affected by these changes.
Yeah, most of the models seem to suggest that what we're going to see in America is we're going to see the central part of the country where typically we've grown the bulk of our commodities, we're going to see those sorts of environmental conditions continue to move north in the country. And so it will become hotter and drier in the south. So those kinds of commodities that were grown there may be less able to survive in the south, and you will continue to move that production belt into the northern parts of the country. And so it will be a displacement of the kinds of things that were the kinds of production that we've had. And I think this is likely true all over the globe, but in the U.S. in particular, that's what most of the models suggest, is that places where corn and soybeans are growing, you're going to continue to move. They're going to shrivel on the southern edge of that region, and they're going to move further north into the northern parts of the country and up into Canada. And what that by implication says is that the crops that are currently grown in those northern regions are going to be displaced and moved to some other location. So we've already seen it. My home state is North Dakota, which is kind of in the center of the continent, really, right up against the Canadian border. And in my lifetime, we've seen a lot of what was typically we're a very large spring wheat producer. A lot of that spring wheat production has moved further north and west and come into that state in a fairly dramatic fashion just during my lifetime. And that's due to a couple of things. In part, it's due to the genetic changes that have happened with improved varieties of corn and soybeans and other crops. But also, it is because of changing weather patterns. We're finding that there's more rainfall in the east, and that it is coming later in the season. And so that means, just by definition, that growing the cereal crops became much more problematic. You had a lot more disease and pest pressures that occurred on them. And also at the same time, it meant that you could grow these other crops in their place. And so we've seen a lot of transition. I suspect you'll continue to see that transition. The models suggest that we will see extreme variability. So it's not just that everything's going to be hotter. There actually will be places that will be cooler. And so it will disrupt existing ecosystems. They're going to have to adapt more rapidly. And if they don't, they're just going to be changing very, very rapidly. And change tends to be disruptive, especially in the environment. So you'll see, well, we're seeing record forest fires, for example, across much of the western part of the U.S. right now, sparked in part as a result of climate change. You're likely to see more and more of those kinds of things. Over the years, we've seen a lot of the forested areas in the mountains die off because of pests that have come in that before couldn't survive because of the cold winters. Well, the cold winters have gotten warmer, and so the pests can come in. They come in, they're in an environment they haven't been before, so you don't have sort of natural resistance. You see a lot of timber die off. That just creates an environment that's very conducive to burning. And so those kinds of things just sort of feed on themselves, I guess is the point. And we're likely to see more and more of that as climate change continues.
So we could be looking at effectively large-scale migration of production and farming communities. Is America prepared for such a change?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that you're going to see the population move so much, other than coastal areas where, as you see sea rise come about, you're likely to see people pull back from the lower levels. I guess you're probably seeing a lot more risk associated with folks that are living in, let's say, the Intermountain West, where the timber is more on fire, those kinds of things. We've been seeing over time folks are having to adapt by building more fire resistant kinds of structures, making sure that there's clearings around them, those sorts of things. It's more likely, I think, that you're going to see substantial production changes than population shifts. That would be sort of my take on this, because in agriculture we're really pretty good at changing quickly and adapting pretty quickly. We continue to learn more things. There are ways that in agriculture you can adapt to climate change. You can do things to your soil that makes it more resilient, that will allow it to hold more moisture. So if you get heavier rainfall periods that are interspersed with longer dry spells in between them, you can adopt practices that might hold soil moisture better so that it can be utilized by those growing plants over the growing season. So we'll continue to adapt, and you'll see production continue to shift, as I've already described. But all of that implies costs, not just on the farmers and the ranchers, but on society as a whole, because all these adaptations, they take time, and they cost money. And all of that, eventually, that bill has to get paid by somebody. And so, as I indicated earlier, you're likely to see at least more spikes in food prices, perhaps like we had in the 2008, 2009 timeframe, where we had production that came in lower than expected. We had lower stockpiles, and so you had major price spikes. You're likely to see more of those kinds of things. You'll see price highs. One of the things that farmers are really good at, though, is responding to those high market prices. And they will do things to rapidly increase production. And one might think, well, that's a good thing. The problem with that is that in agriculture, in food, if you think about it, just a little bit too much food drives prices very, very low and is costly to society and to folks that are trying to survive in this industry. Just a little bit of shortage of food drives prices very, very high. And that's a dynamic in agriculture that's unlike it is in most other industries, in most other businesses across any economy. And that has been the reason why you have had public policies that have been designed to try and support agriculture, not just in the US, but in Europe and all across the globe. Countries understand if you don't feed your people, you're going to lose a government. And so making sure that there's enough food is very, very important. But this delicate balance of between having enough and having too much, and then having the economic disruption that comes as a result of it, is not a good thing either. So more and more variability causes lots of problems. That's the point. I think that we're likely to see more and more of that as climate change continues to worsen.
So the variability in production and the potential fall in US exports could potentially cause some real flashpoints in terms of regional instability.
Well, sure. I mean, there's a lot that has been said about sort of the Arab Spring and all that uprising here that occurred sort of in concert with and right following the big price run up that we had in 08 and 09. And I think that serves to demonstrate the point that you just made with your question here. As you see more variability of production, particularly shortages, you are likely to see more uncertainty, more unrest among the general population. I mean, if there are more and more people who are unable to afford food and the other basics of necessary to support life, you have unrest. I mean, by its very nature, that's exactly what happens. So you are likely to see more of that around the globe, particularly in countries that already have perhaps a large population relative to a low resource base, countries that are less able to feed themselves right now, countries that have a lot of their population in very low income categories. You add stress to that, you double the price of food, and that's a major impact. Now, doubling commodity prices in the US doesn't double food prices. In fact, it rarely has much of an impact on food prices in the US because we're a very developed country and because most of the food that we eat is processed. So if you double the commodity value of that food is a relatively small part of what the consumer pays. That's not the case in undeveloped or developing countries where a high percentage of their food is actually the commodity itself and they're just grinding it and making meal out of it or something. So if you double the price of the commodity there, you have a major impact on the cost of the food for those populations. So it's important to be sort of to understand these different dynamics because high food commodity prices will have an impact in very developed countries, but its impact will be much more dramatic in lesser developed countries. If you have countries that are highly dependent on imports and you have production shortfalls, either in the US or in other major producing countries of the world, such that their exportable quantities shrink substantially, then those importing countries are going to have less available food coming from outside their borders. And it's one of the reasons why there is this movement around the world to which I think is, frankly, a very good movement to try and make sure that you increase the resilience of all countries around the world, that you increase their ability to produce as much of their food as they can, so that you can have some of these buffers available. But anytime you have a shortfall in a world market, which is what we are in, you're going to see prices increase dramatically, and you're going to see lots of spillover effects as a result of that.
We're seeing some devastating forest fires in America right now. What sort of impact is that going to be having on agriculture and on rural communities in the United States?
Well, sure it does. I think it concerns everybody. It particularly concerns folks who are in those regions that are fighting these fires. It's just one of the things that we're going to have to deal with. I mean, you're likely going to all the available scientific evidence surrounding climate change has been saying for years that we are likely to see more and more of those kinds of catastrophic events. And so I'm not here to say that the fires that are occurring here in the western part of the US today are absolutely the result of climate change. Fires have burned all over the world forever. But it is highly likely that there are more fires, that they are more intense fires, that they are fed by more and more dry fuel, that all of which are exacerbated by continuing increases in the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases going into our atmosphere that have a direct impact on how the climate is changing around us. Everything says that we should expect to see more and more of those kinds of dramatic events.
So, how are farmers in the US beginning to adapt to the challenges of climate change?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because I think that adaptation continues whether farmers think that it's a result of climate change or not. They continue to adapt and do so in a fairly dramatic fashion. They are using different kinds of watering technologies. So in places where irrigation has been used, we've advanced from flood control or flood irrigation to sprinkler systems to very pinpoint applications, both above surface and below surface of the soil. So lots of those kinds of adaptations take place. I talked earlier about the different ways of managing the soil, and there's increasing scientific evidence that as you reduce tillage in the soil and increase the population of microflora in the soil, that you increase the capacity of that soil to absorb shock, if you will. So excess rainfall, excess drought, those kinds of things, excess temperatures, lower temperatures. So we're continuing to learn how to manage our soils better. Farmers are adapting. You're seeing more and more farmers that are using crops. It used to be that when I grew up that a lot of fields were summer fallow. They were left fallow in the summer every other year, every third year, in order to effectuate weed control and to capture moisture. The latest technology now suggests that there's less and less advantage to do that. So there's more intercropping that's taking place. There's more cover crops that are being planted. All of these things tend to conserve more of the nutrients in that soil, keep them in that soil so they don't run off into waterways or they don't volatilize into the atmosphere. So we're continuing to learn more about how to manage agriculture, and farmers are adapting pretty rapidly to that. And they'll continue to do that even as climate change continues to grow and to worsen. We will continue to adapt, but that's not to suggest that we shouldn't do anything to try and slow down the change that's occurring in the climate as well. I think it's a mix of both adapting and mitigating those impacts that we need to be employing. And I think you'll find farmers and ranchers across this country, and I suspect around the world, willing to do both of those things, given the right economic incentives. And I think that's the piece that, as policymakers ponder what to do about climate change, that's the place they really need to focus on, is how can you send the right economic signals so that farmers will continue to do the kinds of things that are good for society, besides being good for their economic bottom line.
What measures would you like to see implemented to help farmers be more effective in that adaptation process?
Yeah, well, there are a number of things. I mean, we were early supporters of the proposed cap and trade legislation that passed the House 5-6 years ago. Ultimately, wasn't considered in the Senate. That isn't likely going to materialize again for some long while. But the reason we were early supporters of it is really twofold. Number one, we recognize the need to try and deal with this. But secondly, is because it was a means of providing very direct economic signals to incent farmers to do the kinds of things that we want to have done to reduce emissions. And that's not to suggest that cap and trade is the only way to do that. There are lots of ways you can do that. I mean, you can increase the price of cost, the price of carbon. Folks have talked about a carbon tax as a way of dealing with this. You can just do a number of voluntary measures. If we can develop marketplaces that will incent reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, that will allow farmers to adopt practices like precision fertilizer application, like cover crops, like no-till farming, like certain kinds of managed grazing, all those kinds of things have scientifically been demonstrated can significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we can develop policies that will encourage the adoption of those kinds of practices. And as we do that, those kinds of things can be very useful in terms of beginning to provide some sort of mitigation against climate change.
Looking now to biofuels, what role do you think that they have potentially in helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And also, how do you address the question about this potentially being land that could be used to grow food as opposed to fuel for vehicles?
Yeah, okay. So on biofuels, a couple of things I would say. First of all, biofuels, by almost every measure, are better than petroleum. So nothing is perfect. For every action, there is a reaction. And that's true in nature. It's true it's true everywhere. And so let's just stipulate at the beginning that even though biofuels may not be a perfect solution, they're better than traditional carbon fuels, petroleum, coal, natural gas, that kind of stuff that we're mining from the earth and releasing into the atmosphere. The research in the US suggests that even our traditional corn-based ethanol is a 34% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to traditional petroleum products. So it's better than the alternative. So we're continuing to see the cost of petroleum, environmental costs of petroleum increase as we extract those resources. At the same time, the climate benefits of things like ethanol continue to improve because it's a relatively new technology. We're still learning. We're still advancing technologically pretty rapidly. And so that 34% reduction is likely to get better as the years go by. More importantly, it is really sort of what we always call the next generation biofuels, the advanced biofuels, the cellulosic ethanol, the producing energy out of waste products, those sorts of things. All of that technology is more complicated than corn-based ethanol. It's more expensive than corn-based ethanol, but it's becoming cheaper as we make advances there. The likelihood is that the technology will continue to advance very rapidly, and the greenhouse gas emission reductions are much more profound with those advanced biofuels. So we ought to be continuing to work to use biofuels. As to the question about, well, is there a conflict between food and fuel, are we using land that we could use to raise food, to raise energy instead? I'd say a couple things. First of all, we've always done that. Food is energy, for crying out loud. Food is calories. Calories are energy. It used to be that we farmed with horses and horse-drawn implements, and about a third of the farm was devoted to raising oats and hay and other kinds of feedstuffs to feed the horses, so you could harvest the rest of the stuff that you were selling for human consumption. So it's not like it's this new phenomenon that suddenly we're using corn, which some would say is a human food. Frankly, most of the corn we raise is feed corn. It's not for human consumption anyway. But the point is, we've always used some of our resources for energy production. That's likely always going to be the case. So, and the other part to remember here is that at the end of the day, anyone who is farming for a living has got to make a living. Right now, we're looking at very low commodity prices. Many farmers are struggling financially because the commodity prices have dropped so low that they are below cost of production. So this food versus fuel argument is in many ways, in my mind, just sort of a fallacious argument. We have to have a system that's economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. We've got to have a balance. Folks need to be able to make money and to do things in a sustainable way at the same time.
And how can emission reducing and carbon sequestering agricultural practices and trading schemes help to tackle climate change in the US and around the world?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and it's interesting to note that our organization back in the mid 2000s, National Farmers Union was actually the largest carbon aggregator in the country. We were working to aggregate offsets. That farmers were adopting practices that were environmentally sustainable. They were adopting practices that were demonstrated to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as a result of adopting those practices, there was an emissions trading scheme that was established. The predominant one at the time, I think, was the Chicago Climate Exchange, that's since sort of gone defunct as a result of the loss of the cap and trade program that was deemed to be coming at the time. And so we were on the early end of incenting farmers to do the right things economically, to adopt these practices that are going to reduce emissions. There's got to be a market for it. And that's the piece that we have to develop as a matter of public policy. At that time, it was mostly a voluntary market that was being developed by larger companies, by corporations that wanted to say that they were doing things environmentally sustainable. And so they were willing to pay for these emission reductions that farmers were able to deliver. And that provided the economic incentive for farmers to do that. But I think emissions reductions based on some sort of economic incentives make the most sense.
Why is a strong climate deal at the Paris Climate Conference so important to American farmers?
Well, I think a strong deal coming out of the Paris Summit is important for people everywhere on this globe. There's a growing recognition around the world. We have got to begin to deal in a very dramatic way with greenhouse gas emissions. And there should be a role for absolutely everyone to play in reducing those emissions. That's the importance of the Paris Summit, is how can we arrive at agreements globally that are going to involve countries around the world all providing a meaningful role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think it's important to all of us, as not just farmers, but as humanity.
And finally, what is your message to American and world leaders?
Well, I think that our message to leaders all over the world is just that we need to deal with this problem. It is the problem that this generation faces. It's probably the largest problem that the world faces right now. It needs serious people to sit down and propose and develop and implement serious solutions to it.
I was speaking there to Roger Johnson, the President of the National Farmers Union. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you for joining us here at Climate TV. From everyone at the Climate Group, goodbye.